The television flickered in the dim light of the living room as Robert flipped mindlessly through the channels. The silence of the house felt heavy, pressing down on him with the weight of too many unspoken words and unresolved arguments. 12 years of marriage had carved a routine into their lives, but tonight, something felt different. He couldn't shake the strange feeling gnawing at him. Just as he turned his gaze away from the screen, the sound of heels clacking on the staircase drew his attention. He frowned, puzzled. Vanessa usually wore her fluffy slippers around the house in the evenings. He turned, expecting to see her in sweats or a worn-out bathrobe. What he saw instead made him freeze. Vanessa stood at the bottom of the stairs in a micro bikini, neon green, barely covering her, something he'd never seen her wear, not in all their years together. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders, and her lips were painted in a dark red. She met his shocked stare with a smirk, her eyes challenging. "Surprised?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest and giving him a once-over that felt almost contemptuous. She leaned against the stair railing, one hip jutting out in a way that felt rehearsed. Robert struggled for words. What are you wearing?" he finally managed, a mix of disbelief and anger clouding his voice. "What?" She raised an eyebrow. "Don't like it?" The way she looked at him, the mocking glint in her eyes, made something in him snap. He had felt her slipping away for months now, and he knew things hadn't been right between them. But this... Vanessa tilted her head, smirking as though she had all the power in the world. "My lover likes it," she said, emphasizing the word with a smugness that felt like a punch to his chest. "It's for a party, a bikini-themed party." Her words were laced with mockery, as if daring him to react. He stepped forward, voice low and cold. "Vanessa, what the hell are you talking about? You're not going anywhere dressed like that." She rolled her eyes, barely concealing her irritation. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Like you have any say in what I do." Her voice sharpened, her tone turning cutting. "You're here every night, glued to that couch, while I'm out with someone who knows how to live." His fists clenched, and he took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "This isn't about what I do or don't have, Vanessa. This is about respect, about you walking out of this house, dressed like that, saying things like this." He pointed at her, his voice shaking. She laughed bitterly, folding her arms. "Respect? Don't lecture me about respect. You're lucky I'm even still here. Do you think I want to spend my nights in this dump, scraping by with a husband who can't even afford to take me to a decent restaurant?" His face hardened, and his tone turned icy. "So, that's what this is about? Money? Things? That's what you're after?" She took a step forward, her eyes flashing with a dangerous glint. "Yes, Robert, it is. I'm done living like this. My lover, he knows what I deserve. He gets me designer bags, luxury vacations, things you can't even dream of giving me. You dumbass can't even afford a McDonald's. Look what I'm gonna do." She spat the words out as if each one was a weapon, and with each word, Robert felt himself splintering. "You don't see what you're doing to us," he said, his voice hollow. "To everything we built. You're just throwing it all away." She let out a dry, mocking laugh. "Built? What have we built, Robert? A life of bills and broken promises." Her gaze turned steely. "I'm done waiting around while you struggle to make ends meet. I deserve better." He felt his hands tighten into fists, his pulse racing. "You think this guy's going to take care of you? You're just a game to him, Vanessa." "Maybe," she replied with a shrug, a cold smile on her lips. "But at least it's better than this prison." She gestured around the house, dismissing it as if it were nothing but a shabby cell. Robert stepped in front of her, blocking the doorway, his face inches from hers. "You take one more step out that door, Vanessa, I will break your legs and it's over. Do you understand me?" She held his gaze for a long moment, her face a mask of defiance. "You can't control me, loser. Watch me," she sneered, reaching for the doorknob. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Don't do this," he whispered, a last shred of desperation in his voice. She yanked her wrist free, sneering. "Or what, Robert? What are you going to do?" Her voice was laced with contempt, and she shook her head, giving him one last scathing look. "You're pathetic." She opened the door, the cool night air rushing in, and stepped out without looking back. As the door swung shut, the silence that filled the room was louder than anything he had ever heard. Robert stood there, staring at the door as if it would somehow open, and she would walk back in, laughing, telling him it was all some cruel joke. But he knew better. Vanessa was gone, and her final words echoed in his mind, slicing through him. For a few minutes, he couldn't move, his body frozen, mind churning through a mess of emotions: hurt, anger, disbelief. Then he sank down onto the couch, burying his head in his hands, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had they reached a point where his wife, the woman he had once loved, was walking out of their home dressed like that, taunting him with words he never thought he'd hear? The hours crawled by as he sat there, the house cold and empty around him. He didn't know what to feel, what to think. The memory of her voice, her cruel words, her sneer, replayed in his mind. A knot of rage and despair coiled in his chest, a fury he'd never felt before. This was not just a betrayal. This was her tearing down everything they'd built, stomping on the years they'd shared, leaving him to pick up the pieces. At some point, he rose and paced, his mind still reeling. The night felt endless, stretching on with each passing second as he relived her words. The anger started to simmer, and with it, a strange clarity. He would not beg, would not grovel. He had given her his heart, his loyalty, and she had treated it like trash. In the quiet of that long night, Robert made a decision, one that would shape the course of his life and his future. He would not let her have this last word. She had walked out, choosing someone else over the man who had given her everything he could. She had mocked him, belittled him, but he would not let her win. The night stretched on, each second seeming to taunt Robert with its silence. He had tried to shake the anger, tried to sleep, but his mind kept racing back to Vanessa's words, her sneer, the way she dismissed him like he was nothing. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, too tense to relax, wondering how long he'd been lying there in the dark. Then his phone buzzed. He checked the screen. The number was unknown. Frowning, he opened the message. It was a video file. He hesitated, a strange knot forming in his stomach, but something told him to press play. With a deep breath, he tapped on the video, and his world changed forever. The screen flickered, and there she was, Vanessa, laughing, her face flushed. She was with a man Robert didn't recognize, and they were tangled together in a way that left no doubt. They were in bed, her arms wrapped around him and riding on top of him like crazy. Her laughter filling the room as they shared an intimate moment, oblivious to the camera capturing it all. Robert's hand trembled as he held the phone. He could hear her voice, carefree and full of excitement, a tone he hadn't heard from her in years. The man leaned in, whispering something that made her laugh even harder, and then they kissed. It was a careless display of passion, one that made his stomach turn. He watched, numb, as the video continued, his brain struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. This was his wife, the woman he'd promised his life to, the same woman who had just walked out on him with no remorse. And here she was, with another man, laughing as if nothing else mattered. Robert clenched his jaw, anger bubbling up from somewhere deep inside him. He forced himself to watch the entire video, every second of it, letting each frame etch itself into his mind. When it ended, he sat in silence, the phone slipping from his hand onto the couch beside him. He had suspected it for months. Little things, late nights out, unexplained texts, the way she'd grown distant. But now, seeing the truth so blatantly, he realized he'd been lying to himself, holding on to some small hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong. That hope was dead now. Robert sat up, his mind strangely clear. There was no more need for hope, no more waiting or wondering. The answer was right in front of him, and there was no denying it anymore. Without a word, he stood and walked to the bedroom. The room looked the same as it always had, their shared life scattered across every corner. The bed they had shared, the photos on the dresser, the clothes in the closet, all of it felt like a mockery now. He grabbed a small suitcase from under the bed and opened it, tossing in a few clothes, his laptop, his essentials. It wasn't much, but it was all he needed. His hands moved automatically as he packed, each item thrown into the suitcase with a finality he hadn't felt before. He was leaving, and he wasn't coming back. There was nothing left for him here. He walked over to the dresser, opening a drawer where he kept his important documents. He pulled out the envelope with his name scrawled across it, containing their marriage license and, coincidentally, a blank set of divorce papers. He'd printed them months ago, a grim backup plan he'd never wanted to need. Now, he realized he'd never needed anything more. Taking the papers to the kitchen, he sat at the table, his hands steady as he filled in each section. It was clinical, almost mechanical, as if his emotions had shut off completely. He signed his name at the bottom, sealing his decision with the stroke of a pen. In that moment, the marriage was over, its pieces reduced to ink and paper. He placed the divorce papers on the table, right where she'd see them when she returned, and left his wedding ring beside them. It felt strange seeing it there, but there was a sense of closure in it too. He'd worn that ring for over a decade, a symbol of a commitment he'd taken seriously. But she hadn't, and now it was nothing more than a reminder of a broken promise. With his bag in hand, he walked through the house one last time. The memories hung around him, ghosts of a life that had once seemed so full of promise. He paused at the doorway to the bedroom, remembering the countless mornings they'd spent there, the laughter, the shared dreams. All of it felt hollow now, tainted by her betrayal. He didn't look back as he closed the door behind him, stepping out into the cool night air. It was strange, standing there on the street, his bag in hand, knowing he was leaving everything behind. But there was a sense of freedom in it too, a weight lifting from his shoulders as he turned away from the house that had once been his home. He walked to his car, unlocking it and tossing his bag in the back seat. He sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly, letting the reality of his choice sink in. This was it. There was no going back, no second chances. He took a deep breath, started the engine, and drove away, the house disappearing into the distance. As he drove through the empty streets, his mind began to wander. What would she think when she came home and found the divorce papers waiting for her? Would she feel any regret? Would she even care? Part of him wanted to believe that she'd be devastated, that she'd realize what she'd thrown away. But another part of him knew better. She'd made her choice, and now he was making his. The city lights blurred past him as he drove, the hum of the engine filling the silence. He thought about the life he was leaving behind, the dreams he'd once had, the promises they'd made to each other. It was all gone now, reduced to a pile of papers and a broken heart. But as he drove, he felt a strange sense of relief, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. He had no idea where he was going, no plan, no destination. But for the first time in a long time, he felt free, unburdened by the weight of a marriage that had turned into a prison. He would rebuild his life, piece by piece, without her. And he would do it on his terms. The night stretched on, the road winding ahead of him, leading him into a future that was as uncertain as it was promising. But as he drove, he knew one thing for sure. He was done being a victim. Vanessa stumbled through the front door, the soft click of her heels echoing through the still house. She shut the door behind her, leaning against it, a lazy smile on her face. Her hair was tousled, makeup smudged slightly, and the scent of expensive perfume mingled with the sharp tang of alcohol. She kicked off her heels, barely glancing around as she walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, humming under her breath. But then she noticed it, the eerie silence. Usually, there was some faint sign of life in the house, the quiet hum of the heater, the glow of the TV screen, or even the sound of Robert's gentle breathing from the bedroom. Tonight, however, was different. Everything felt hollow. "Robert," she called, her voice slicing through the silence. No answer. She moved into the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water, still more amused than worried. She figured he was sulking somewhere, trying to give her the silent treatment. After all, she'd been pushing his buttons for months now. He would get over it, he always did. But then she spotted the table. A single envelope lay in the center, neat and precise, as if it had been placed there with intent. She picked it up, eyes narrowing. The bold letters spelling her name on the front seemed foreign somehow, like they belonged to someone else. Curiosity gave way to something heavier as she tore open the envelope. The divorce papers stared back at her, the black ink practically searing into her mind. She blinked, almost as if she didn't believe what she was seeing. Flipping through each page, she felt a cold, sinking feeling in her stomach. "This has to be some kind of joke," she whispered, laughing under her breath. "Really, Robert? You're actually leaving?" She spoke to the empty room, her laughter echoing hollowly. The silence was her only answer. She pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping Robert's contact almost instinctively. The line rang once, then went straight to voicemail. She hung up and tried again, telling herself he'd answer, that he was probably in the next room, waiting for her to come find him. When it went to voicemail again, she frowned, her amusement replaced with a prickle of irritation. She left a terse message. "Robert, you don't have to be so dramatic. Call me back." She tossed the phone onto the table, expecting it to ring any second. But it didn't. Vanessa paced the room, glancing at the clock on the wall. Minutes passed, then an hour, and still nothing. She tried calling again, her voice now carrying a hint of urgency. "All right, Robert, enough. Where are you? Call me back." She left message after message, her frustration turning to something colder. But still, the phone stayed silent. The next morning, she woke up on the couch, phone in hand, her eyes bleary. She checked her phone immediately, expecting to see a missed call, a text, something. But her screen was blank. She dialed again, listening to the robotic tone informing her his phone was off. Now, the initial irritation shifted to a sick feeling of dread. She spent the next few days calling, leaving messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Robert, please just answer. We can talk about this." Her voice cracked as she left message after message. She tried to convince herself that he was just angry, that he'd come back when he'd cooled off. But as days turned into weeks, the reality began to settle in. He was gone. The emptiness of the house pressed down on her, an oppressive silence she couldn't shake. Every corner seemed to remind her of him, the closet with his clothes still hanging there, his books on the shelf, even his toothbrush in the bathroom. She began avoiding certain rooms, unable to handle the ghosts of memories. She found herself staring at the divorce papers again, still lying on the table, a cruel reminder of his final decision. She had never thought it would come to this. She had always believed Robert would stay, no matter what. After all, he'd never left her before, no matter how many times she'd hurt him. A strange sense of panic gripped her one night as she sat alone, the darkness of the empty house pressing in on her. She scrolled through old photos, her fingers trembling as she lingered on images of them together, smiling, happy, sharing moments that now felt like they belonged to someone else. She pressed her hand to her mouth, suppressing the unfamiliar burn of tears. She didn't want to admit it, even to herself, but a small part of her was afraid. Afraid he might never come back. Meanwhile, for Robert, each day away from Vanessa felt like shedding a layer of skin. At first, he had to remind himself to keep moving forward, to silence the doubts that tried to creep in. He kept his days packed, throwing himself into work, into rebuilding himself from the ground up. He rented a small apartment across town, modest but quiet, a place where he could start fresh. Each morning, he'd rise early, pouring his energy into his new business venture, a consulting firm that he'd only dreamed of before. The betrayal had lit a fire in him, pushing him to chase after his ambitions with a newfound intensity. He worked late nights, weekends, building contacts, drawing up strategies, putting in the hours. Success didn't come easy, but he thrived on it, each small victory giving him a rush of satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. In the silence of his new apartment, he found peace, a calm he hadn't known he needed. Here, he was free from her disdain, her demands, her condescension. For the first time, he could focus on himself. As the weeks passed, his business flourished, his reputation growing as clients began to take notice. He pushed harder, his determination fueled by the memory of Vanessa's sneering words, her dismissive attitude. He was proving to himself, and to her, even if she didn't know it, that he was worth more than she'd ever believed. Months later, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He opened it, curiosity flaring, only to see it was from Vanessa. A simple message, her tone oddly tentative. "Robert, please. Can we talk?" He stared at the message, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and detachment. He let the message sit, untouched, unread in his inbox. The man he was becoming didn't need her validation. He'd found a strength within himself, a resilience she'd tried to undermine for years. He was carving out a new life, and he wasn't going to let her pull him back into the darkness. Back at the empty house, Vanessa's desperation deepened. She sent message after message, each one more pleading than the last. She was haunted by the silence, by the growing realization that she had underestimated him. She had thought he would always be there, always waiting for her. But now, she saw how wrong she'd been. The once bright memories they'd shared turned bitter in her mind. She couldn't escape the ache that gnawed at her, couldn't silence the regret that grew louder with each passing day. She had thrown him away, dismissing him as nothing. And now, she was alone, the echoes of her own choices reverberating through the house like a curse. But for Robert, those echoes were a distant memory. He'd learned to live with the pain, had turned it into something stronger. His life was now his own, and with each step forward, he left the betrayal further behind. The darkness had passed, replaced by a new dawn, and he was determined to make the most of it. 3 years had passed since Robert had left the pain and betrayal behind. He had found a new sense of peace, surrounded by people who valued him, including Laura, the woman who had walked into his life just when he'd least expected it. She was genuine, full of warmth, the kind of person who saw him for who he was without any ulterior motives. With Laura, he felt like he was finally living in color again, the bitterness of the past fading away. Robert sat on his porch one cool autumn morning, his coffee in hand, glancing over the view of his backyard. It had become his favorite place to reflect, a space he'd built from scratch, just like his life over the last 3 years. The peace was interrupted by the gentle clink of the mailbox lid closing as the mail carrier left, a slight rustling sound that made him glance up. He walked over and sorted through the usual envelopes, mostly bills and a few ads. Then, one envelope caught his eye, a cream-colored letter, handwritten, the ink smudged slightly on one side. He didn't need to see the return address to know who it was from. The familiar handwriting on the front brought a surge of emotions he'd long buried. Anger, pain, betrayal. Robert hesitated. Part of him wanted to toss the letter into the trash, to let it disappear without a trace, but curiosity got the better of him. Finally, he opened the envelope, unfolding the letter with steady hands. Vanessa's words filled the page, and her desperation practically seeped from every line. "Dear Robert," it began, "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, and you have every right to hate me. I would hate me too if I were you. I've lost everything, Robert. The man I left you for, the one I thought was my salvation, turned out to be nothing more than a thief and a liar. He took everything, drained my savings, left me in debt I can barely pay. The life I thought I wanted, it was all a lie." Robert clenched his jaw, a mix of pity and anger swirling in his chest. He continued reading, Vanessa's words painting a bleak picture of her current life. She described how the bags, the clothes, the trips, all of it had been repossessed or sold to pay off the debts she'd been left with. She was working 2 jobs, barely scraping by, struggling to keep a roof over her head. She had gone from lavish nights and luxury apartments to late shifts and cheap rentals. The letter grew even more desperate as she pleaded for forgiveness. "I see now that I had something real with you. I had stability, love, a partner who cared about me. And I threw it all away for someone who saw me as a toy, a bank account. I know I can never undo the damage I caused, but if there's any chance at all, I would do anything to make it right. I was a fool, Robert, and I am paying the price every day." She continued, apologizing for her cruelty, her selfishness. She even begged for a second chance, asking if he'd meet her, just to talk, maybe see if there was anything left between them. Her words seemed to blur into each other, her desperation ringing clear as she acknowledged her mistakes. As he finished reading, Robert sat back, a long sigh escaping him. The anger he'd felt initially was gone, replaced by something more detached. He realized with some surprise that he felt almost nothing. 3 years ago, this letter might have shattered him, might have filled him with a false hope or bitterness, but now it was just sad. Vanessa, the woman he'd once loved, was now a stranger, caught in a life she had chosen herself. He heard a car pull up in the driveway and looked out the window. Laura was back from her morning run, her cheeks flushed from the cool air. She spotted him at the window and waved, her smile bright and familiar, grounding him. She made her way inside, dropping her bag by the door. "Morning, stranger," she said, a teasing lilt in her voice as she leaned over and kissed him. "What's with a serious face?" Robert held up the letter. "It's from Vanessa," he said simply. Laura's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't press him. She nodded, sitting across from him at the table, giving him space. "How is she?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Not well," he replied, glancing down at the letter again. She wants to meet. She's asking for another chance." He sighed, setting the letter aside, the weight of her words lingering in the room. Laura didn't flinch, didn't react with jealousy or insecurity. She only looked at him with the same warmth she always did. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Robert took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Honestly, nothing. I don't feel anything for her anymore. I feel like I should be angry or satisfied or, I don't know, but I just feel indifferent." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Is that wrong?" Laura smiled, her fingers tracing gentle circles on his hand. "No, it just means you've moved on. You've done the work, Robert. You're happy, and that's all that matters." They sat in silence for a while, a comfortable quiet that Robert had come to appreciate more than anything else. He thought back to all the nights he'd spent sleepless, wrestling with the anger and betrayal that had once consumed him. But now, that pain was just a memory, a reminder of a different life. After a few moments, he stood, grabbed the letter, and walked over to the fireplace. Laura watched him, understanding in her eyes. He opened the glass door, placed the letter inside, and lit a match, watching as the flames licked up the edges of the paper, curling it into ash. As the letter burned, he felt a sense of finality he hadn't realized he needed. Vanessa's plea, her regret, it was nothing more than words on paper, now disappearing into smoke. She had made her choice, just as he had made his, and there was no going back. Once the letter had turned to ash, Robert closed the fireplace door and turned back to Laura, feeling lighter than he had in years. He walked over, pulling her into a hug, feeling the warmth of her embrace surround him. This was his life now, a life he had built, a life he had earned, and he wouldn't trade it for anything. "Let's go make breakfast," Laura said, a playful smile dancing on her lips. He grinned, following her into the kitchen. "Only if you're making the coffee." They laughed, a sound that filled the house with warmth, erasing any lingering shadows of the past. It was a brisk, rainy afternoon when Robert finally decided to meet Vanessa. He'd spent weeks debating it, wavering between a desire for closure and a nagging reluctance to dig up the past. But something in him needed to see the reality of what she had become, needed the satisfaction of closure that a letter alone couldn't bring. He chose a small, out-of-the-way cafe for their meeting. It was nearly empty, the kind of place where conversations were muffled and nothing too memorable happened. When he arrived, Vanessa was already sitting at a corner table, her posture stiff and anxious. She looked around nervously, her hands fumbling with an old, worn purse, a far cry from the designer bag she used to flaunt. Robert took a deep breath and approached. He reminded himself that this wasn't a reunion, only a conversation, one he needed to finally lay the past to rest. "Robert," Vanessa murmured as he sat across from her. Her voice was small, uncertain, a shadow of the sharp, confident tone he remembered. Her face was thinner, paler, her eyes ringed with fatigue. She looked like someone who hadn't had a full night's rest in years. "Vanessa," he acknowledged, his voice flat. He took a moment to study her, noting the difference in her appearance, the worn look that had replaced the confident sparkle she once flaunted. She broke the silence first, her eyes downcast. "Thank you for meeting me. I know I don't deserve it. Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I wasn't sure I'd come, to be honest. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for a glass of water, taking a small sip before placing it back on the table. She took a deep breath, as though steadying herself. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. I'm not sure where to start, but she swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Robert. For everything. For what I did to you. Sorry doesn't really cut it, he replied, his gaze steady. You didn't just make a mistake, Vanessa. You made a choice. Repeatedly, she winced at the harshness in his voice but nodded, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the table. I know. I thought I was doing what was best for me, chasing something better. But it wasn't real. She looked up, eyes glassy with unshed tears. It was a fantasy, and it left me with nothing. Nothing, he echoed, a faint smirk playing on his lips. I thought you had everything, Vanessa. Remember? He leaned forward, holding her gaze. You threw it all in my face. Told me I was just a loser who couldn't give you what you wanted. Her lip quivered, but she held his stare, determination flaring in her eyes. I know, Robert. I was wrong. I was so wrong. And I don't know what I was thinking, but she dropped her head, her voice a whisper. I miss you, Robert. Robert felt a stab of bitterness and satisfaction, a strange combination. He fought the urge to laugh, instead watching her with a detached curiosity. What do you want from me, Vanessa? He asked coldly, folding his arms. She bit her lip, her voice trembling. I don't want anything. I just wanted to see you, to tell you I regret everything. If I could go back, I would choose you. Every time. She looked up, desperation written all over her face. Robert, please. I know I have no right to ask, but would you ever consider giving me another chance? For a moment, he just stared at her, her words hanging in the air. She was trembling, clutching her purse as though it might keep her from crumbling entirely. Another chance? He repeated slowly, raising an eyebrow. Vanessa, I don't think you understand how far I've come without you. The disappointment in her eyes deepened, and her lips pressed into a thin line. I've changed, Robert. I'm not that person anymore. I don't care about the money, or the bags, or the luxury. I just want a second chance to make things right. He scoffed, shaking his head. Changed? You made your bed, Vanessa. You had a life with me, a life you could have appreciated, but you threw it away. You think a few years of regret and hardship mean you're somehow entitled to a fresh start with me? A tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, regaining her composure. I know it's selfish to ask, but I don't know what else to do. I'm trying to start over. I have nothing left. Robert's gaze softened slightly, but he held firm. Nothing? What about the man you left me for? All the promises of a better life? Her face twisted, and her fingers tightened around the glass. He disappeared, left me with debts, took everything, and I never saw him again. I tried to make it work on my own, but she stopped herself, her voice breaking. I lost everything, Robert. I don't even have a home anymore. A long silence stretched between them as he digested her words. For a brief moment, pity flickered within him, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by a cold sense of justice. So, now you want me back, he said, his voice laced with irony. Convenient, don't you think? She shook her head, her voice pleading. No, that's not it. I mean, maybe yes, but not just because I need help. It's because I still love you, Robert. I see now what I had, what I lost. He couldn't help a dry laugh at her words. Love? Vanessa, you have no idea what love is. You gave up on it the minute something better came along. You threw us away for a fantasy, and now that you've hit rock bottom, you come crawling back. And I'm supposed to just forget all of it? She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I don't expect you to forget, or even forgive. I just hope you might understand. Robert shook his head, rising from his chair. Understand? Vanessa, I don't think you understand anything. I've moved on. I've built a life without you, a life that's fulfilling, and frankly, I'm glad you're not in it. Her face crumpled, but she quickly composed herself, nodding in acceptance. I get it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, or a second chance, Robert watched her for a moment, a strange calm washing over him. He could see the regret, the misery that had replaced her former arrogance. But there was no pleasure in watching her suffer. He felt nothing but relief that he no longer had to be a part of her life. With a sigh, he turned to leave, his voice steady. "Goodbye, Vanessa." As he walked away, he heard her choked sobs behind him, but he didn't turn back. He stepped out of the cafe into the brisk autumn air, breathing in deeply, feeling lighter, as if he'd finally closed a chapter he'd thought would haunt him forever. That evening, Robert walked through the door, greeted by the familiar scent of rosemary and garlic wafting from the kitchen. The soft glow of the lights illuminated the room, casting a warm ambience that welcomed him back from the weight of his day. He paused for a moment, appreciating the comfort of his new life, a life he had fought hard to create. "Hey there," Lena called from the kitchen, her voice bright and inviting. She was stirring a pot on the stove, and the sight of her instantly eased the tension that had followed him home. "Hey," he replied, slipping off his shoes and moving towards her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close for a moment. "How was your day?" "It was good. Just the usual craziness at work," she said, looking over her shoulder with a smile. "But I'm glad to be home now. I missed you." Robert kissed her cheek, feeling a rush of affection. "I missed you too. It's nice to come home to this." As Lena stirred the pot, he grabbed a glass from the cabinet and poured himself some water. They talked about their day, the little mundane details that felt significant in the warmth of their connection. He told her about a tough meeting with a client, and she shared a funny story about a mishap at the office. "I wish I could have seen it," he laughed, imagining the scene she described. "You should have recorded it." "I know, right?" Lena chuckled. "I'm still getting used to the craziness there. You wouldn't believe how some people act." After dinner, they settled on the couch with a bottle of wine, a movie playing softly in the background. Lena leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Robert felt a deep sense of gratitude, recognizing that this love was built on trust and respect, unlike the foundation he had once shared with Vanessa. "How are you feeling about everything?" Lena asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "With Vanessa, I mean." Robert took a deep breath, considering her question. "I'm okay, really. I think I've let it go. I can't say it doesn't still hurt sometimes, but I'm learning to focus on what I have now." "Good," Lena said, looking up at him with earnest eyes. "You deserve happiness. You've worked hard to get here." Robert nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him at her words. "I know that now. I didn't realize how much I was holding on to until I started to let it go." Meanwhile, a few miles away, Vanessa was sitting alone in her darkened apartment, surrounded by silence. She scrolled through social media, her heart tightening as she came across a post from Robert. He was smiling, his arm wrapped around Lena, both of them radiating happiness. It felt like a punch to her gut. "What did I do?" she whispered to herself, the weight of her choices crashing down on her. She had exchanged love for a superficial lifestyle, and now she was left with nothing but regret. Desperation clawed at her as she dropped the phone onto the couch. She tried to ignore the feeling that was creeping up inside her, the realization that her choices had led her here, to this empty apartment, this empty life. Each day was a struggle, each moment a reminder of what she had lost. She thought back to her conversations with Robert, how easy it had been to take his love for granted. In her pursuit of wealth and status, she had blinded herself to the very thing that had made her life meaningful. With a heavy sigh, Vanessa reached for her purse and pulled out a few crumpled bills. She had just enough for takeout. As she ordered, she wondered how she had gone from dining at fancy restaurants to scraping by. The luxury she once flaunted was gone, along with the man who had truly cared for her. Back at Robert's place, the evening had turned into a cozy affair, the glow of the TV lighting up their faces as they enjoyed each other's company. As the credits rolled, Robert felt a wave of contentment wash over him. "Let's do something fun this weekend," he suggested, turning to Lena. "What do you think about a little getaway?" "Just us?" "Sounds perfect," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Where should we go?" Robert thought for a moment, remembering a quaint cabin in the woods he had once visited. "I know a great place by the lake. We could hike, relax by the water." Just a nice escape from everything. Let's do it, Lena said enthusiastically. I'll pack our bags. As they made plans, Robert's heart felt lighter. He realized he was ready to fully embrace this new chapter, free from the chains of his past. It was a choice he had fought for, and it was time to live it. The next day, Vanessa woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the table. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from an old friend, inviting her to catch up over coffee. For a moment, she considered it. But then, the weight of her reality pulled her back down. No one wants to hear about my problems, she muttered, shaking her head. As she prepared for another long day of job hunting, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was a shadow of her former self, the confidence and vibrancy she once had replaced by a dull ache. She brushed her hair back, trying to mask the truth, but the image only deepened her despair. Still, she pushed herself out the door, determined to find something, anything, to hold on to. With every rejection email she received, the knowledge of her past choices settled deeper into her bones. At a cafe, she met with her friend, who was bright and optimistic, sharing stories of her recent promotions and adventures. As Vanessa listened, she felt a pang of envy. She wanted that life back. Are you okay? Her friend finally asked, noticing Vanessa's distant gaze. You seem off. I'm fine, Vanessa lied, forcing a smile. Just been busy looking for jobs. Her friend nodded, but the concern was evident. You know, if you need anything, I'm here for you. It's tough out there. Vanessa swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to spill her secret. Thanks. I appreciate it. When the conversation turned back to light-hearted topics, Vanessa felt the walls closing in. She excused herself to the bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror, willing herself to be strong. Get it together, Vanessa, she whispered, splashing water on her face. You'll figure this out. But as she left the cafe, the truth lingered. She was lost. Every step away from her past felt like a step deeper into a fog of confusion and regret. Back at Robert's place, the weekend getaway was approaching, and Robert felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. Lena helped him pack, tossing in snacks and clothes, their laughter filling the space as they prepared for their adventure. Do you think we'll see any wildlife? Lena asked, her eyes alight with curiosity. Maybe, Robert replied, laughing. I just hope we don't encounter any bears. Oh, come on. That would be a story for the ages, she said, nudging him playfully. As they loaded the car, Robert felt a rush of excitement. He had made it through the dark times, and now he was ready to embrace the life he had built. He looked at Lena, who was animatedly discussing their hiking plans, and felt a wave of gratitude. This was what he had fought for: freedom, joy, and the chance to love again. Ready? He asked, smiling at her. More than ready, Lena replied, her enthusiasm infectious. As they set off, the road stretched before them, a path leading to new memories, new adventures. And as Robert drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, watching the shadows of his past fade away, finally leaving behind the weight of what could have been.